The Intergalactic Military Academy on Nexus Station had a reputation that preceded it like a particularly unpleasant smell, the kind that makes you wrinkle your nose and wonder what died. For 3 centuries, it had been churning out the galaxy's finest warriors, or at least that's what the brochures claimed. What it actually produced was a steady stream of traumatized cadets, inflated egos, and enough bureaucratic nonsense to power a small moon. The Academy's founding principle was beautifully simple. Throw a bunch of different species together, make them compete for everything from food rations to bathroom privileges, and see who crawls out alive. Natural selection with extra steps and significantly more paperwork. The station itself was a marvel of engineering inefficiency. A massive rotating wheel that somehow managed to generate artificial gravity while simultaneously making everyone slightly nauseous. Its corridors buzzed with the chatter of a dozen different species, all convinced they were the galaxy's gift to warfare. The Krillian mantis people clicked their mandibles in superiority. The crystalline Zephyrians hummed in frequencies that made your teeth ache, and the gaseous nebulites, well, nobody was quite sure what they were doing, but it involved a lot of colored smoke. But it was the Vorthak who truly owned this place. 7 feet of scaled muscle and attitude, they strutted through the Academy like they owned it, which, given their species' political influence in the Galactic Defense Coalition, they practically did. Their philosophy was refreshingly straightforward: might makes right, and if you disagreed, they'd be happy to demonstrate why you were wrong. Usually with their fists. Humans, in this grand hierarchy of galactic toughness, rank somewhere between houseplants and particularly aggressive butterflies. They were tolerated at the Academy mostly as a formality. Their species had been granted membership in the coalition after some bureaucratic oversight that nobody wanted to admit to. The general consensus was that humans were soft, slow, and entirely too fond of talking their way out of conflicts instead of settling things properly with violence. Which brings us to Kai Chen, who was doing an admirable job of reinforcing every stereotype about human fragility. At 5'6" and possessing all the intimidating presence of a slightly confused librarian, he moved through the Academy like he was apologizing for taking up space. His dark hair was perpetually messy, his uniform never quite fit right, and he had this annoying habit of actually reading the tactical manuals instead of using them as weights like a proper warrior. The other cadets had taken to treating him like a mascot, harmless, vaguely amusing, and occasionally useful for reaching things on high shelves. The instructors ignored him entirely, which in the Academy's ecosystem was actually a form of mercy. After all, why waste time on someone who clearly wouldn't survive their first real deployment? This delicate social balance might have continued indefinitely if not for the Vorthak concept of entertainment, which typically involved someone else's pain. The morning started like any other at the Academy, which is to say it began with the kind of breakfast that made military rations look like fine dining. Kai sat alone at his usual table, methodically working through something that claimed to be protein, but bore a suspicious resemblance to recycled boot leather. Around him, the cafeteria hummed with the usual morning chatter, Krillians discussing battle tactics, Zephyrians harmonizing about honor codes, and Vorthak cadets loudly debating whose ancestors had killed more enemies in hand-to-hand combat. It was Zexstar who first noticed the human sitting by himself. As far as Vorthak went, Zexstar was fairly typical, built like a tank that had been crossbred with a particularly aggressive crocodile, with scales that gleamed like polished armor and teeth that suggested his species had never heard of vegetarianism. What set him apart was his creativity when it came to making other beings miserable. "Look at the little soft skin," he announced to his pack of followers, his voice carrying across the cafeteria with all the subtlety of a plasma cannon. "Eating alone again. How pathetic." His companions, 3 other Vorthak cadets who shared his talent for creative cruelty, turned to observe their target with the focused attention of predators spotting a wounded animal. There was Kresh, whose idea of diplomacy involved breaking things until everyone agreed with him, Vex Lon, who collected scars like some species collected stamps, and Torg, who wasn't particularly bright but made up for it with enthusiasm for violence. "Maybe we should invite him to join our combat training session," Zexstar continued, his lipless mouth stretching into what might charitably be called a smile. He could use the practice. The other Vorthak chuckled, a sound like gravel being processed in a cement mixer. They'd been looking for entertainment, and the human provided an opportunity for both amusement and practical demonstration of Vorthak's superiority. An hour later, the Academy's training hall Delta echoed with the sounds of organized violence. The chamber was designed to accommodate various forms of combat, with adjustable gravity, atmospheric controls, and medical sensors that would automatically summon help when someone was about to die. The walls were scarred from decades of training exercises, and the floor bore permanent stains that the maintenance crew had long since given up trying to remove. Today's exercise was hand-to-hand combat assessment, a regular evaluation where cadets demonstrated their martial prowess under the watchful eyes of Instructor Veltar, a grizzled Zephyrian whose crystalline form had been chipped and scarred by countless battles. He approached training with the enthusiasm of someone who had seen too much combat and wanted everyone else to share the experience. The exercise was simple enough. Cadets would be paired randomly for sparring matches, with points awarded for technique, aggression, and the increasingly rare quality of not dying during the assessment. It was, in theory, a fair evaluation of combat skills. In practice, it was an opportunity for the stronger species to remind everyone else of their place in the food chain. Zexstar had volunteered to demonstrate proper grappling techniques, which was his way of saying he wanted an excuse to hurt someone legally. When the random pairing system somehow selected Kai as his opponent, and wasn't it remarkable how these random systems always seem to favor certain outcomes, the Vorthak's scaled face lit up with predatory joy. "Excellent," Instructor Veltar announced, his crystalline voice ringing through the chamber. "Cadet Zexstar will demonstrate advanced grappling with Cadet Chen. Remember, this is about technique, not domination." Which was roughly equivalent to asking a supernova to be subtle. The match began conventionally enough. Zexstar circled his opponent with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved by applying sufficient force. Kai, for his part, maintained a defensive stance that suggested he understood exactly how outmatched he was. The first exchange was almost gentle by Vorthak standards. Zexstar grabbed for Kai's arm, intending to demonstrate a simple throw that would put the human on his back with minimal damage. It was meant to be educational, a practical lesson in the realities of galactic power dynamics. But somewhere between the grab and the throw, Zexstar's grip shifted. His scaled fingers found Kai's hand, and instead of executing the planned technique, he applied pressure in a very specific way. The crack of breaking bone echoed through the training hall with the finality of a judge's gavel. Kai's little finger bent at an angle that defied both anatomy and common decency. The human made a small, sharp sound, not quite a scream, more like the noise someone makes when they accidentally bite their tongue. But he didn't fall. He didn't cry out. He just stood there, looking down at his mangled digit with the expression of someone who had just received mildly disappointing news. "Oops," Zexstar said, his voice carrying all the sincerity of a politician's campaign promise. "Accident." The training hall fell silent. Even the other cadets, who had grown accustomed to the Academy's casual brutality, recognized that something had shifted. This wasn't training anymore. This was something else entirely. Instructor Veltar approached with the measured steps of someone trying very hard to pretend everything was normal. His crystalline form caught the hall's artificial lighting, throwing rainbow patterns across the scarred walls. "Medical attention for Cadet Chen," he announced with bureaucratic efficiency. "Training will continue." But Kai raised his uninjured hand, a gesture so casual it might have been asking for the salt at dinner. "I'm fine," he said, his voice steady in a way that made several observers distinctly uncomfortable. "The exercise can continue." He cradled his broken finger against his chest with his good hand, the gesture strangely gentle. There was something in his eyes now, not pain, not anger, but a kind of focused attention that reminded some of the older cadets of predators they'd encountered on their homeworlds. "You sure about that, Softskin?" Zexstar asked, his confidence wavering slightly. There was something unsettling about the human's reaction, or rather, his lack of one. "I'm sure," Kai replied. "Though I think we should probably inform Captain Vorthak about this training accident. He'll want to know about potential safety issues with the exercise protocols." The mention of the Vorthak captain's name sent a ripple through the assembled cadets. Captain Vorthak was a legend among his people, a warrior who had personally led boarding actions against pirate vessels, who had never retreated from a battle, and who viewed mercy as a personal failing. He was also notoriously protective of Vorthak honor and had strong opinions about proper conduct. 20 minutes later, Captain Vorthak arrived in Training Hall Delta like a natural disaster with military decorations. At 8 feet tall and built like an armored siege engine, he moved with the predatory grace of something that had evolved specifically to kill other things. His scales were darker than those of the younger Vorthak, marked with ritual scars that told the story of a dozen campaigns. His eyes, the color of molten copper, swept the training hall with the focused attention of a professional killer. "Where's my cadet?" he rumbled, his voice like distant thunder. Zextar stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had never been wrong about anything in his life. "Captain, there was a minor training accident. The human was injured, but nothing serious." Vorthak's gaze shifted to Kai, taking in the cradled hand, the too steady expression, the way the small human seemed to be evaluating everything around him with new attention. "Show me," the captain commanded. Kai extended his injured hand without hesitation. The finger was clearly broken, bent at an angle that made several observers wince. But what drew Vorthak's attention wasn't the injury, it was the human's reaction to it. "You seem remarkably composed for someone who has been injured," the captain observed, his tone carefully neutral. "Pain is temporary," Kai replied with a shrug. "Besides, accidents happen during training. I'm sure Cadet Zextar didn't mean for this to occur." There was something in the way he said it, a subtle emphasis that suggested multiple interpretations. Vorthak, who had survived decades of combat by reading between the lines, caught the implication immediately. "Indeed," the captain said slowly. "Accidents do happen. Though in my experience, true accidents rarely occur when proper safety protocols are followed." He turned to address the assembled cadets, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never needed to raise it to be obeyed. "I am told this was a demonstration of grappling techniques. Perhaps we should have a proper demonstration, so that everyone understands the correct procedures." The training hall buzzed with sudden tension. When a Vorthak captain offered to provide personal instruction, it usually meant someone was about to receive an education they wouldn't soon forget. "Cadet Chen," Vorthak continued, "since you were the victim of this unfortunate accident, perhaps you would like to observe proper technique? Or would you prefer to return to medical for treatment?" It was phrased as a question, but everyone present understood it was a test. The human could take the offered escape, accept medical treatment, and fade back into obscurity. Or he could stay and watch his tormentor receive what passed for justice in the Vorthak military system. Kai considered for a moment, still cradling his broken finger. When he looked up, there was something different in his expression, a hardness that hadn't been there before. "Actually, Captain, I'd like to request a formal challenge." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to have physical weight. Formal challenges were serious business in the Intergalactic Military Academy. They were legal, regulated, and very rarely requested by species that weren't naturally equipped for combat. "A formal challenge," Vorthak repeated, his copper eyes narrowing. "Are you certain? The regulations are quite specific about the consequences." "I'm familiar with the regulations, sir. Article 847 of the Academy Combat Code allows any cadet to request formal satisfaction for injuries sustained through the negligence or malice of another cadet. The challenge may be issued to the offending cadet or, if that cadet is deemed to have acted under orders or influence, to their immediate superior." The fact that the human knew the regulations by heart sent another ripple through the assembled crowd. Most cadets learned the combat code through experience, usually painful experience. Few bothered to memorize the actual text. Captain Vorthak's expression shifted from mild interest to something approaching respect. Not many beings, regardless of species, had the courage to formally challenge a Vorthak warrior. Fewer still survived the experience. "You wish to challenge Cadet Zextar?" he asked. "No, sir," Kai replied, his voice steady. "I wish to challenge you." The training hall erupted in shocked murmurs. Challenging a fellow cadet was one thing, foolish, but understandable. Challenging a decorated Vorthak captain was the kind of decision that usually ended with the challenger becoming a cautionary tale. Vorthak studied the small human for a long moment. There was something about the way Kai stood, the set of his shoulders, that reminded the captain of other warriors he had known. Not the flashy, posturing fighters who announced their prowess to anyone who would listen, but the quiet ones, the dangerous ones. "You understand," he said carefully, that formal challenges in the academy are conducted under combat regulations. No restrictions, no safety protocols. The challenge ends when one participant yields, is rendered unconscious, or dies. I understand, sir. And you understand that I am a decorated combat veteran with 43 confirmed kills in personal combat. I do, sir. And you still wish to issue this challenge, knowing that your species is considered unsuited for direct confrontation. For the first time since the conversation began, Kai smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the kind of smile that made evolutionary biologists rethink their assumptions about human dietary preferences. So, I think there may be some gaps in the Academy's information about human combat capabilities. Captain Vorthak felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine uncertainty. He had faced enemies across a dozen star systems, had killed in ways that would give seasoned warriors nightmares, and had never encountered anything he couldn't eventually overcome through superior strength and technique. But there was something about this small, injured human that set off every instinctual warning he possessed. It was the same feeling he'd experienced before boarding that pirate vessel in the Kepler sector, the sense that he was about to encounter something that didn't fit the established patterns. Very well, he said finally. I accept your challenge. We will convene in Combat Arena 7 in 1 hour. That will give you time to receive medical treatment and prepare. The hour passed with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for natural disasters and tax audits. Word of the challenge spread through the Academy like wildfire, and by the time the participants arrived at Combat Arena 7, every available viewing space was packed with cadets, instructors, and support staff. Combat Arena 7 was the Academy's premier venue for formal challenges, a circular chamber 50 meters in diameter, surrounded by reinforced viewing galleries that could withstand everything short of a direct orbital bombardment. The floor was covered with a specialized material that absorbed impact while providing excellent traction, and the walls were lined with medical sensors that would summon emergency teams the moment they detected life-threatening injuries. Captain Vorthak entered the arena with the casual confidence of someone heading to a particularly easy workout. He had stripped down to regulation combat gear, lightweight armor that protected vital organs without restricting movement, and weapon harnesses that were conspicuously empty. This would be settled with claws and fists, the traditional Vorthak way. Kai entered from the opposite side, and his appearance sent a murmur through the crowd. The human had received medical treatment for his broken finger. It was now splintered and secured against his hand. But it was his expression that drew attention. Gone was the apologetic, slightly confused demeanor that had characterized his time at the Academy. In its place was something that made several observers unconsciously step back from the viewing galleries. Referee Captain Thexva, a crystalline Zephyrian whose body bore the modifications that marked her as a veteran of the border wars, took position at the center of the arena. Formal combat challenge between Captain Vorthak of the Vorthak Defense Corps and Cadet Kai Chen of the Human Colonial Forces, she announced, her voice amplified throughout the arena. Combat will continue until one participant yields, is rendered unconscious, or expires. Medical intervention will occur only after combat conclusion. Participants, acknowledge understanding. Acknowledged, Vorthak rumbled. Acknowledged, Kai said quietly. Combat begins, now. Captain Vorthak approached the engagement with textbook precision. He circled his opponent at a distance that maximized his reach advantage while minimizing the human's mobility options. His stance was perfect, balanced, ready to explode into action, protecting his vital areas while keeping his weapons, claws and teeth, readily available. Kai, for his part, seemed to be doing very little. He stood in the center of the arena, turning slowly to keep his opponent in sight, his hands hanging loose at his sides. To most observers, he looked like someone who had just realized the magnitude of his mistake. The first exchange seemed to confirm everyone's expectations. Vorthak moved with the fluid speed of a natural predator, closing the distance and launching a devastating combination that should have ended the fight in seconds. His claws swept toward Kai's torso with enough force to tear through standard body armor. Kai moved. It wasn't the desperate scramble most had expected, but something else entirely, a sideways step that took him just outside the arc of Vorthak's attack, followed by a movement that was too quick for the eye to follow properly. Vorthak's forward momentum carried him past his target, and he found himself off balance for just a moment. In that moment, something struck the nerve cluster behind his left knee with surgical precision, sending his leg into temporary paralysis. The Vorthak captain stumbled, more surprised than hurt. He spun to face his opponent, reassessing the threat level. Kai stood exactly where he had been before, hands at his sides, expression unchanged. If not for Vorthak's tingling leg, it would have been possible to believe nothing had happened at all. Interesting, the captain admitted. You have some training. Some, Kai agreed. The second exchange was more cautious. Vorthak feinted left, then drove forward with a technique that had served him well in a dozen campaigns. This time he was ready for the human speed, compensating for the expected evasion. Kai didn't evade. Instead, he moved forward, into the attack, his shoulder striking Vorthak just below the sternum with enough force to lift the massive Vorthak off his feet. The captain landed hard, his breath driven from his lungs, and rolled away just in time to avoid the human's follow-up strike. The viewing gallery erupted in shocked commentary. No one had expected the human to survive the first minute of combat, much less launch successful counterattacks against a decorated Vorthak warrior. Vorthak regained his feet, his copper eyes now showing the focused attention of someone who recognized genuine danger. The small human across from him wasn't just trained, he was lethal in ways that didn't immediately announce themselves. "What are you?" he asked, circling more cautiously now. "I'm human," Kai replied, and somehow the simple statement carried more menace than any threat could have. The third exchange changed everything. Vorthak launched a complex attack pattern designed to overwhelm opponents through sheer aggression, a berserker assault that had broken enemy formations and ended personal duels throughout his career. Kai met it head-on. What followed was less a fight than a demonstration of applied physics. The human moved with mechanical precision, every action calculated to maximum efficiency. Where Vorthak struck with raw power, Kai redirected and amplified. Where the captain relied on natural weapons, the human turned his entire body into a precision instrument. The end came suddenly. Vorthak overextended on a particularly aggressive swipe, and Kai stepped inside his guard. What happened next was too fast for most observers to follow, but the result was unmistakable. Captain Vorthak, decorated veteran of 43 personal combats, hit the arena floor with a wet cracking sound that made the medical sensors scream their electronic warnings. His head was turned at an angle that suggested several very important bones were no longer performing their intended function. Kai stood over his fallen opponent, breathing hard but not winded. For the first time since entering the arena, he looked up at the stunned viewing gallery. "Medical team to combat Arena 7, he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the shocked silence. "Captain Vorthak requires immediate attention for cervical spine trauma." The emergency response was textbook perfect. Medical teams swarmed into the arena within seconds, stabilizing the unconscious Vorthak and preparing him for emergency surgery. The captain would live, though his fighting days were definitively over. As the medical team worked, Academy Administrator Vorthak, a Zephyrian whose crystalline form marked him as old enough to have witnessed the formation of the Galactic Defense Coalition, made his way to the arena floor. "Cadet Chen," he said, his harmonics betraying his confusion. That was unexpected. "Yes, sir," Kai agreed, finally allowing exhaustion to show in his posture. "I imagine it was. Would you mind explaining how a human cadet was able to defeat a veteran Vorthak captain in single combat?" Kai looked down at his splintered finger, then back at the administrator. When he spoke, his voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining something that should have been obvious. "So, humans have mandatory military service. Every adult human spends a minimum of 2 years in active military training, with an emphasis on personal combat skills. We've been fighting wars for our entire recorded history, against each other, against hostile environments, against anything that threatened our survival." He gestured to the unconscious captain being loaded onto a medical transport. "Captain Vorthak is a decorated warrior with 43 kills. I'm a fairly typical human, with 6 years of active duty and approximately 312 confirmed kills across 7 different combat zones." The silence that followed this statement was profound. "But," Administrator Vorthak managed, "your species is classified as non-combative. Your psychological profiles indicate an aversion to violence, a preference for diplomatic solutions. Oh, we do prefer diplomatic solutions, Kai agreed cheerfully. We just don't let that preference make us weak. We learned a long time ago that sometimes violence is the only language certain people understand. He looked around the arena, taking in the shocked faces in the viewing gallery, the stunned instructors, the suddenly respectful expressions on the faces of species that had dismissed humans as harmless. We also learned that when someone hurts one of ours, he continued, flexing his broken finger experimentally, the appropriate response is to hurt them back. Proportionally. As if to emphasize his point, the medical team's scanner chimed with an update on Vorthak's condition. 3 fractured vertebrae, torn ligaments, and a concussion that would keep him unconscious for days. Survivable, but definitively career-ending. I see, the administrator said slowly. And this is typical human doctrine. Standard procedure, sir. We call it proportional response. Someone breaks our finger, we break something more important of theirs. The implications of this statement rippled through the assembled crowd like waves through water. If humans operated under proportional response doctrines, and if this demonstration was any indication of typical human combat capabilities, then several species were going to need to drastically reassess their diplomatic strategies. Over the following days, the Academy underwent what historians would later describe as a cultural adjustment period. Humans, previously ignored or treated as amusing curiosities, suddenly found themselves receiving a level of respect that bordered on reverence. The commissary began serving food that was actually edible. Instructors started using proper names instead of dismissive generalizations, and the Vorthak cadets developed a sudden interest in conflict resolution through dialogue. Zextar, in particular, seemed to have undergone a philosophical transformation. He could be found in the Academy's medical wing several times a day, bringing Kai small gifts and inquiring about the healing progress of his finger with the desperate attention of someone who understood that his continued good health depended on his victim's recovery. The Academy's administrative staff worked with unprecedented efficiency to review and update their files on human military capabilities. What they found in the official records made for interesting reading. Humans had been fighting continuous wars for over 12,000 years of recorded history, had developed martial arts systems that treated the human body as a precision weapon, and maintained active military forces that could deploy anywhere in known space within 72 hours. More disturbing was a revelation that humans had been deliberately downplaying their capabilities during diplomatic first contacts. Their representatives had emphasized their preference for peaceful resolution, their love of art and philosophy, their dedication to scientific advancement, all perfectly true, but apparently not the complete picture. Captain Vorthak eventually recovered, though his days as a combat instructor were definitively over. He requested a transfer to the Academy's Diplomatic Corps, where his newfound appreciation for the complexities of interspecies relations would serve him well. He never spoke publicly about his defeat, but those who knew him noticed that he had developed a habit of treating smaller species with considerably more respect. Kai returned to his usual routine, quiet, studious, polite to his instructors and fellow cadets. The only visible reminder of the incident was his splintered finger, which he wore like a badge of office. When asked about his future plans, he indicated that he intended to complete his academy training and return to human space for assignment to a colonial defense posting. His academic performance, never poor to begin with, improved dramatically as instructors began paying actual attention to his work. His tactical analysis papers were circulated among the faculty as examples of innovative thinking, and his practical scores in combat exercises showed a marked improvement, though he was careful never to demonstrate the full extent of his capabilities again. The galaxy, it seemed, had learned an important lesson about assumptions and first impressions. Humans, those apparently soft and diplomatic creatures who preferred talking to fighting, were dangerous in ways that didn't immediately announce themselves. They were patient, methodical, and utterly ruthless when the situation demanded it. And perhaps most disturbing of all, they were really good at appearing harmless right up until the moment they decided not to be. In the end, the incident at the Intergalactic Military Academy served as a watershed moment in interspecies relations. Diplomatic protocols were quietly updated, military assessments were drastically revised, and a new understanding emerged about the relationship between civilization and the capacity for violence. As one senior Galactic Defense Coalition official noted in a classified memo, "We have spent centuries cataloging species by their obvious capabilities, size, natural weapons, aggressive tendencies. The humans have reminded us that the most dangerous predator is often the one that doesn't look like a predator at all." The Intergalactic Military Academy updated its promotional materials to reflect this new understanding. No longer did they promise to turn soft species into warriors. Instead, they offered to help warriors of all species reach their full potential. It was a subtle change in language, but one that acknowledged a fundamental shift in galactic perspective. After all, when you break a human cadet's finger and minutes later find your decorated captain's neck broken in return, you start to reconsider your assumptions about which species are truly dangerous. The Academy's new motto, quietly adopted but never officially announced, became something of an open secret among the staff. Appearances can be deceiving, but results rarely are. It was, most agreed, a lesson worth remembering.